From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. And we're going to start with the markets today because not big surprise, given those stunning jobs numbers, they are up rather unambiguously. And to bring it all to us, we welcome now Abigail Doolittle. Abigail?
Really looking at a best case scenario here, not just for that payrolls report with 2.5 million Americans back to work, which is great in new jobs, really fortunate and good news for this country. But that's also good news for the stock market, which might not have been the case because in some ways with the S&P 500 up 40% before today from the March lows, you could have made the case this is what markets were hoping for. So it's not a sell the news event, it's a buy the news event. So investors, the S&P 500 and stocks, a forecasting tool in the future, telling you that perhaps we're going to continue to see strong economic data. And you can see a rally right across the board. The Dow is up even more than the S&P 500. That has to do with the strong cyclical tilt to this rally, David, with the energy, industrials, financials really leading the way. And there's that energy index there, up 8%, if you can believe it, David. Energy, and I guess you could in a way since oil's been all over the map, but now truly in recovery mode. The energy index nearly up 100% since its March low. So investors all in on the day, David, on risk assets.
Yeah, well, Abigail, they may be buying the news because they didn't have a rumor, because nobody thought it was going to come out this way, right? They couldn't
Truly
buy in
surprising.
advance. At
Yes.
the same time, we've been talking about possible rotation out of bonds. Are people leaving bonds because they like equity so much?
They certainly are, to such a degree that right now the 10-year yield is backing up the most ever. It's up about 28 basis points on this week, David. Today alone, I think about 9 or 10 basis points. Yield trades inverse to price. So that, of course, tells you investors going out of bonds. And that money today does certainly seem to be going into stocks. Whether or not that dynamic will continue, money out of bonds and into stocks is to be seen. But if it does happen, and today it appears to be happening, it could suggest that there may just be another leg to this most hated rally ever. But again, the S&P 500 up 40% into today, a forecasting tool on what proved to be, a very promising jobs report, especially against the backdrop for such negativity. It's great that it came out the way that it did, David.
Yeah, no question about that. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Well, as Abigail Doolittle said, we had an estimate of losing 7.5 million jobs last month, and it turns out we gained 2.5, a 10 million job swing. So not surprisingly, President of the United States, Donald Trump, decided to take a victory lap in a news conference just a short time ago, and where he said that we had outstanding numbers, but it's just the beginning because he thinks there's long-term growth coming. This is part of what he said.
The numbers are great, and this leads us on to a long period of growth. We'll go back to having the greatest economy anywhere in the world, nothing close. And I think we're going to have a very good upcoming few months.
And now we're joined by the person we always talk to on subjects like this. He is Michael McKee. He is our Chief Economic and Policy Correspondent. Mike, great to have you. I was watching you as these jobs numbers came out. I've never seen you so nonplussed on the air, as you had every right to be. You were stunned with the rest of us.
We all went into this trying to guesstimate how bad the number would be, David. So when it came out and said 2.5 million jobs, I thought, oh, well, that's like ADP. We lost 2.5 million. And then I read we gained, and it was quite a surprise. We also saw the unemployment rate fall to 13.3%. Another big surprise, was supposed to go up to 19%. Now, the BLS had its usual caution. They've had real trouble accounting for unemployment during the COVID crisis. And they say if everybody had been properly classified, unemployment would have been 16.3%. But if everybody had been properly classified last month, it would have been 19.5%. So either way you look at it, a significant improvement in the numbers. And pretty much all of the underlying numbers were improvements as well, with one exception of unemployment for blacks, which rose during the month of May. And that becomes somewhat important given the context of what we've been going through over the last 10 days or so. But everything else, pretty good. And it's hard to see where you would find a fault with this report. The question is, does it last? And that's going to be the real question for people up on Capitol Hill as they decide whether they want to do a fourth stimulus or not.
Exactly. Let me pick up on that, though. Do we have any ability to look ahead and decide whether these really good jobs numbers, which we all value, are a timing issue? That is to say, are we borrowing from future months? Or is this really an overall growth in the jobs situation?
Well, we don't really know, and that's going to kind of be the problem. the idea of waiting to July to talk about a stimulus package may have some merit in that we want to see if there was a real PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, impact in the numbers. Did people bring workers back onto payrolls and still be paying them with government money, but not as an unemployment insurance because they weren't doing any work? As the country opens up over the next month, we'll get a much better read on that, how much demand there is, how many people come back because their companies need them rather than because the government was paying them to keep them on the payrolls. That's going to be the real question in deciding what we need. Also, you saw the number, the average hourly earnings drop significantly. That's because the people who came back onto payrolls were among the lowest paid. What happens with that $600 a week bonus for unemployment? Do they extend that? Do they drop that off? And how does that affect incentives to work and hire? A lot of questions that we don't have answers to at this point that would go into deciding what you want to do and how much more you might want to spend.
One final one. You mentioned the differentiation between blacks and Hispanics and whites on the other hand. There was also differentiation among sectors where it looked like construction, manufacturing, retail, healthcare did really well. Other places didn't do well at all, like hotels.
Yeah, it really kind of lines up with what you were able to do. Construction workers could come back because of some openings in various states, and the weather is starting to get good, so you would expect that. The restaurant workers, 1.3 million come back to work. That was a surprise. It may have had to do with more with PPP than the people actually going to restaurants, because we know even in states that were open, restaurant capacity is lower. But we know people weren't traveling. So as you say, the hotel industry not doing as well, airline industry not doing as well. We'll see what happens as we go into the next month, as we go into the numbers for June and see whether they improve. One area we do want to mention that will impact the decision on whether to add stimulus is we still lost over 500,000 government jobs. And that could get a lot worse if there isn't money put into another stimulus program for states and cities. So we have to keep an eye on that.
So true. Thank you so much to Michael McKee for that report. Coming up, we're going to talk with Austan Goolsbee of the Chicago Booth School of Business about the state of the economy and the need for that stimulus bill that Mike was just talking about. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It is time now for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. President Trump says he expects the U.S. economy to recover from the coronavirus outbreak even faster than predicted after today's jobs report showed a surprise gain of millions of jobs. The president spoke in the White House Rose Garden.
The numbers are great, and this leads us on to a long period of growth. We'll go back to having the greatest economy anywhere in the world, nothing close. And I think we're going to have a very good upcoming few months.
Mr. Trump also signed a bill to increase flexibility in the Paycheck Protection Program. The measure gives businesses more time to use money available and have loans forgiven. Here in New York City, health officials are optimistic this is a major turning point against the pandemic. For the first time since March, the city had no confirmed deaths from the coronavirus. In April, at the peak of the pandemic, New York City saw about 600 fatalities a day. The latest round of Brexit talks between the UK and the European Union finished today without a trade agreement. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, accused the UK of backtracking on commitments it made when it left the bloc. He warned that the talks had made no progress. That will add pressure for Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the EU President Ursula von der Leyen to intervene directly. A group of senior lawmakers from 8 countries, including the United States, has formed an alliance to help counter what they say is the threat posed by China. The Interparliamentary Alliance on China says it will focus on what China's growing influence means for global trade, security, and human rights. Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio and New Jersey Democrat Bob Menendez are among those leading the group. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Austan Goolsbee served as President Barack Obama's chief economic advisor, and he is now professor of economics at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. We welcome him now back to Bloomberg. So welcome, Austan. It's great to have you. We have to start with those jobs numbers. We want to know about the economy overall, but those jobs numbers were knockout. What happened?
Yeah, it was a pleasant surprise for sure that we started adding jobs sooner than we thought we were going to. I think it's important to remember the context that we had a giant drop in jobs. This refills maybe 10% of the hole from the previous month, and mostly it's concentrated in the leisure and hospitality sector. Of the 14 big sectors that the Bureau of Labor Statistics keep track of, 5 of them employment fell. In 9 of them it went up, but in only 1, leisure and hospitality, did the majority of the job creation come from. So overall, it's a pleasant surprise to get a number that doesn't seem to match with some of the negative numbers coming out of UI, and we're going to just have to see how this goes.
Well, and that's the question. We don't know yet, but do we have any indication yet whether these really strong numbers and surprisingly strong numbers indicate that the jobs recovery will come sooner, or are we really borrowing against future months?
I think we're keeping our fingers crossed that this is going to keep going. I think the upside is that it was a nice, strong number. The downside is, unlike the job declines last month, this one is focused really in just the one sector, leisure and hospitality. You saw massive job losses across the board in every industry. This might be more of the short-term rebound effect because it's concentrated in what was one of the hardest hit of all the industries. But hopefully not. Hopefully this is the mark of something that's going to begin to be more broad-based.
So Congress, with the president, have injected trillions of dollars now into the economy. There's talk about more to come, including things like the payroll protection plan. Do we have any way of knowing the extent to which that's helping generate these favorable numbers?
Yes, that's super important, but we don't really have a way to know that because the Small Business Administration and the White House have not been tremendously forthcoming with information about who's getting the money. If we knew that, if we had more oversight in that way, we could track, in a sense, what's happening to the employment of people who got it versus people who didn't, and stuff like that. I think we will get over time a better read on the size of firms. And if you saw this rebound concentrated among the types of firms that would be eligible for the payroll protection, then that would at least be pointing you in that direction. But I think right now we really don't know how much of this was policy and how much was just rebound because economic activities come back a little bit.
Does that uncertainty and the need to wait to find out indicate anything about timing of further stimulus? Because Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has been saying we've got to go right now. She's got a very big, over $3 trillion package to go, including state and local support, other support for individuals. The White House and the Republicans are saying, well, we can wait a little longer, although the White House seems to say we need some money for the states. The president mentioned again this morning also maybe some money for infrastructure. Is it possible that this indicates, these numbers would indicate it's okay to wait until July?
I don't know. I'm nervous about that, but I do think the spirit of your question is 100% accurate, that this took a little bit of the wind out of the sails of saying it's really quite imperative that we get in. The unemployment rate is astoundingly high, remains even after this month the highest in almost a century. You saw the White House and the White House's allies say, oh, well, this is a sign that we don't need to extend some of these rescue programs. And so that probably means it's going to end up like everything else in a big partisan food fight, and it probably adds some uncertainty and delay to what that relief might be.
Austan, these dramatic numbers come at the end of a week that has been racked with demonstrations, even riots across the country, as people demonstrated against that tragic killing of George Floyd up in Minneapolis. I do have to note that in these numbers, maybe one downside is it looks like the black unemployment rate did not go down at all, even as white and Hispanic unemployment did go down. What does that indicate? Why is that true? Especially because, if I remember correctly, on the downside, blacks were disproportionately hit by losing jobs.
Yeah, it's true. The unemployment rate for African Americans rose this month, even as the overall employment picture was improving. I think that much of that is probably about what sectors different groups work in. So the positive contribution on jobs, as I say, the majority of the jobs were in the one sector of leisure and hospitality. That's not an abnormally disproportionate African American employment sector. If you look at Hispanics, that does tend to be more disproportionately in leisure and hospitality, and the Hispanic unemployment rate fell quite a bit this month. I think that issue of disparities across racial groups, across education groups, across geographies, that was with us before this COVID crisis ever began, and the COVID crisis has made that worse. And nothing changed this month really in that diagnosis. The overall thing is we just had the worst job hit in the history of the United States. And what happened this month only filled that hole about 10%. We're still have an unemployment rate that is unbelievably high, and we've got to get that unemployment rate down.
Yeah, Austin, it's so important what you said, that we had the bad and growing inequality problem before COVID hit. COVID made it worse because, very sadly, blacks and Hispanics were disproportionately hit by that. But are we also making it worse by what we're doing to save the economy? And that is both in the monetary and the fiscal side. As we inject money into the system, there's a piece actually on the Bloomberg today about how companies now can borrow a lot more money and are borrowing a lot more money even as they're laying people off. Are we helping the people who have and not helping the people who have not?
I hope not. I don't think so. I think that mostly our policy response has been about trying to prevent this temporary, hopefully temporary hit from morphing into a Great Depression. And if we have a Great Depression style recession, that's going to be bad for everybody. So I do think intentionally we've been trying to move quickly to prevent further damage. But because we're moving quickly, I do think we are going to find numerous hiccups like what we saw with PPP, where people look and say, wait a minute, there are a bunch of small businesses who couldn't qualify, and there are a bunch of big businesses that said they were small and they got money, and the Los Angeles Lakers got money. So I think we are due for a bunch more things like that, where companies take money from the Fed or the federal government and they still lay off the workers. But I don't think so far the policy, I think you'd have to describe the policy as helping, not hurting.
Okay, Austin, thank you so much. It's always a treat to have you on. That's Austan Goolsbee. He is professor of economics at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. And a programming note now, Wall Street Week will premiere tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and then run through the weekend. And we'll be joined by Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, and Mona Mahajan. She is a investment strategist with Allianz. That's coming up tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, and it is Boeing. It appears that airlines are on their way back, with the TSA saying that we have a lot more people using airlines than we thought, and Boeing really is driving the Dow. To explain it all to us, we're welcome now Abigail Doolittle.
Well, David, we really do have the shares of Boeing absolutely soaring there, no pun intended, up about 15%, the best day in almost 2 months. But it's part of a broader rally. In fact, right now, Boeing on pace for its best week since the end of March within a 3-week rally. And behind this, you really have two components. First of all, we do seem to have a return to the sky by Americans and American Airlines yesterday, as you know, talking about the fact that they are boosting their flight capacity for the month of July supply by 74%. Now, that's down on a year-over-year basis, but it does provide some optimism around this beaten down sector on the pandemic. You know, air flying basically all but halted. Second, we do have that positive jobs report. As you know, more than 7 million Americans were expected to lose jobs. Instead, 2.5 million have gained jobs. That could create a sense of optimism that will help any pent-up demand for travel that Americans can let go of those discretionary dollars. And relative to the export numbers, David, this is important because if you can believe it, was a little bit surprising to me to learn about this, but export from a standpoint, Boeing has actually been the #1 exporter. So if Boeing gets back in business in terms of building planes and parts, it could really boost that trade balance as well, David.
Well, address that point as well, Abigail, if you would. It's not just Boeing, it's all the people who supply parts to Boeing, all the people that work in all those places. Is there any indication that they're also coming up with things like Boeing as we anticipate more air traffic around the country?
Well, we do certainly have a rally for some of those air part suppliers right across the board. So every company really related to air travel, whether it's the planes themselves, the airlines, or the aircraft suppliers, big rallies. Investors want in on this beaten down sector because, again, it was hit the worst coming out of the pandemic. So there's the sense that if we really do start to see Americans take to the skies, millennials apparently a little bit more welcoming to this idea of wanting to get back in the air. But if we see people get into the air more quickly than expected, and not just for leisure, but also if there's more business travel than expected at some point later this year, we don't know if that's the case, but there's some sense of optimism that that could happen, that we could see some more travel happening. And speaking of travel, David, very interesting. President Trump during his press conference did mention the idea that he is buying an RV, and on that we saw Winnebago, those shares reverse a loss and spike higher. So it seems many people right across the board want in on this potential return to travel.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that because as I listened to that, I thought, what's going to happen to Winnebago as he turned to Mike Pence and said we have to go to Indiana. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report. On Stock of the Hour, coming up, we're going to talk with Adrian Perkins. He's the mayor of Shreveport, Louisiana, one of the cities that has experienced demonstrations. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The Trump administration is imposing new limits on Chinese airlines. The United States said today that China had violated airlines' rights by limiting flights and would only allow 2 flights a week in total from Chinese airlines to enter the country. On Thursday, China said it would limit U.S. airlines to 1 flight per week each. Iran continued its elevated rate of nuclear fuel production last quarter, even as the coronavirus pandemic forced it to shut down much of the economy. The country's store of low-enriched uranium increased by more than 50% over the past 3 months. That's according to an International Atomic Energy Agency report seen by Bloomberg. It's enough of the heavy metal to create 2 bombs if Iran chose to enrich the material to weapons grade. The European Union is planning to extend a ban on most travel to the bloc until at least July 1st. The EU has said member nations should first remove internal border controls triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. The curb on non-essential travel was first put in place in March and has been extended twice. Brazil has now passed Italy to have the 3rd highest death toll from the coronavirus. The country reported more than 1,400 deaths over the past 24 hours. In all, more than 34,000 Brazilians have died from the disease. Brazil accounts for about 40% of the world's daily virus deaths. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, cities across the country are bracing for a second weekend of likely protests. This in the wake of the tragic killing of George Floyd up in Minneapolis. Well, Shreveport, Louisiana has its fair share of protests, but they've been peaceful thus far. We welcome now the mayor of Shreveport. He is Mr. Adrian Perkins. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for joining us. Really appreciate it. What has been the key thus far to your success in having lawful protests that are peaceful?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me on. And the key to our success is simply making sure that we allow our citizens to have their voice. I'm a military veteran. I fought for the Constitution, and we're letting the protesters know, hey, you have a right to assemble, and we're going to protect you and keep you safe. So we're very supportive of the movement, and our ears and hearts are open to their concerns.
Do you expect protests through the weekend, sir?
We do. There was an announcement at the first protest that they would protest for 45 days, and we've already gotten some people that have applied for applications. So, yeah, there'll be multiple protests throughout the weekend.
So, Mr. Mayor, you say you were a veteran. You sell yourself just a little bit short. You attended West Point. You were president of your class, first African-American, as I understand it, president of a class at West Point, and then you went on to be a captain, an artillery captain. How did you react to the back and forth between the President of the United States on the one hand and the former Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, and the former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, about whether federal troops should be used to keep the peace?
Yeah, honestly, when I was in uniform, I was extremely, bipartisan, apolitical, and I would never get caught up in anything like this. So I completely understand the retired flag officer's position on that. The military is to make sure that we, primarily fight our enemies that are foreign. And only in the, biggest emergencies do we fight, domestic type of, or be involved with domestic type of instances. And, this doesn't rise to that. These are people exercising their constitutional rights. State governors and even local mayors are handling the situation on the ground accordingly.
Mayor Perkins, we've gotten some dramatic numbers on job creation last month. As a nation overall, give us a sense of the situation in Shreveport. What's the state of your economy? What's the state of employment and unemployment there?
Yeah, so the state of our economy, we aren't doing well, just like cities across the country. We're struggling to balance our budget in the face of unprecedented shortfalls due to COVID-19. Shreveport is already resource constrained. I came into office about 18 months ago and inherited a $1.2 million deficit. Now we're able to tighten our purse strings and turn that deficit into $4 million, but COVID is definitely going to wipe that away. Our initial projections, we thought that we'd have about a $25 million shortfall. So that's the things that we're fighting right now. We're focusing on balancing the budget right now, but we've avoided layoffs, and that's what we were really, really focused on.
You're down there not too far from the oil patch. Are you being affected by what's going on with the oil markets, particularly in the shale industry? I think you have a fair amount of drilling activity, don't you?
Yeah, we do. And that's affecting our economy as a whole. A lot of our clearly managerial positions and a lot of our citizens work in the oil field. We have Bentler Steel here. They've announced that 3/4 of their workforce will be cut down, at least temporarily, and they'll make the final call next January to see how the market rebounds. We also have a massive gaming industry here, and we've had a casino announce a permanent closure. So, yeah, we're getting hit in multiple ways.
We'll talk about that casino because I know you have had a fair amount of gambling, legal gambling down there. How's the situation with COVID-19 in Shreveport, and to what extent is that really inhibiting businesses such as a casino?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you know, but our governor announced that we'll be going into phase 2. So businesses that were open in phase 1 will be able to expand to 50% capacity. Our casinos are opening back up, but we're continuing to monitor the situation. All data indicates that local economies in warm weather states like Louisiana are recovering faster, and that warm weather invites people to get out and be more active, shop. And in phase 2, we're also encouraging our people to shop local so that we can keep dollars here. But what we don't want is for, as people go back into casinos and other businesses that are opening, is for the spread of the virus to tick back up. And fortunately, we are not seeing that. We didn't see that in phase 1.
Well, that's great, and we hope that that continues. President Trump himself, though, who really favors opening up as fast as possible, today said we have to be prepared for some flare-ups here and there. Do you have what you need in terms of testing, in terms of contact tracing? Do you have an infrastructure that can handle it if you do have some instances flare back up?
Yeah, I will say this. Shreveport was actually the most tested city and parish in the state of Louisiana when Louisiana was the most tested early on in this pandemic. But I will say mid and smaller cities often aren't equipped with the type of medical and public health infrastructure that Shreveport has. So although we have what we need, a lot of other like cities don't have what they need. And I will say personally, I have to protect lives before I protect livelihoods. We can't have an economy without the people. So again, we are watching the data. And again, if there are flare-ups, we're doing everything we can to prevent flare-ups. But if there are flare-ups, I will be the first person to make sure that we, put precautions in place to protect our citizens.
So finally, Mayor Perkins, give us your sense of the larger picture across the United States, because we're all so mindful of what's going on right now, what we're watching, some of which is because of police brutality, which is unjustified and needs to be addressed, some of which is because of underlying inequalities, economic and otherwise, in our economy. As a leading official, what would you prescribe for the country? What would you like to see done that might address the underlying causes of some of the anger?
Yeah. Well, I will say, just describing the big picture, we've jumped from crisis to crisis to crisis. People are tired. People are exhausted. We went from the COVID-19 pandemic to an economic crisis, and now we're in the middle of addressing racism in a very serious way. Leadership is more important than ever. Leaders at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level need to listen right now and need to be humble. The people are screaming out for help. A lot of things that have fueled the economic crisis and the protest is the inequalities in our society. We are been knocked down. We're in a bit of a rubble state right now, and we need to build ourselves up more equitably. And the only way we do that is by listening to the people that gives us the authority in the first place. So leadership is extremely critical. If we keep our hearts and our minds open, I think we'll get through this and we can be a stronger country.
Thank you so much, Mayor Perkins. That's Mayor Adrian Perkins of Shreveport, Louisiana. Coming up next, we're going to talk to Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO about the remarkable events of this week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Radio, I'm David Weston. Well, it's been a remarkable week, marked by civil disobedience, civil unrest across the country in the response to the tragic killing of George Floyd, also attempts to reopen the economy, and then we have these remarkable jobs numbers out just today. So we're particularly delighted to have Richard Trumka, president of AFL-CIO, with us. The AFL-CIO represents more than 12.5 million working men and women across the country. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with part of this that you were, at least literally, figuratively, in the center of. That was those demonstrations there at Lafayette Park going across to St. John's Church. For people who don't know the geography of Washington, your AFL-CIO headquarters are right there on that block with St. John's Church. As I understand, there was damage done. So who was responsible? What happened?
There was some damage done. It was some errant people. I mean, they weren't peaceful protesters. They were some people trying to take advantage of the situation to create chaos. And, it just proved one thing, David. The AFL-CIO is not a building. We're a group of living people that have arms locked together to try to bring social justice back to America.
So let's talk about the social justice, because every institution is confronting this right now in the wake of the George Floyd killing. How is it affecting your members? How is it affecting your operations? How do you deal with the question of inherent racism in our system?
I think it affects every American out there, regardless of your color, race, or sex, or anything else. And so what we're trying to do is focus on three things. Look, we have three crises going on simultaneously right now. We have the health crisis, we have the economic freefall, and then we have the crisis of structural discrimination. And we're trying to do all of those together. We have an emergency meeting of our Civil and Human Rights and our Policy Committee today to talk about those and a course of action and how we can be better effective and do more to reform the criminal reform movement, how we can do more to end racism in the country, whatever form it comes in, because it's a labor issue to us, because it's so endemic in the workplace. And so we consider it a labor issue. We're struggling with it like everybody else, but we intend to be at the forefront of the solutions.
What about policing reform? We know that Speaker Pelosi says that she wants to have a bill as early as Monday about policing reform. Part of the AFL-CIO is the International Union of Police Associations. What about the police unions? To what extent do they have responsibility? To what extent can they be part of the solution here?
Well, look, here's the way we look at it. We have a number of unions that have police officers in them. And, you know, people have said, why don't you cut ties with them? First and foremost, we believe police officers and everyone who works for a living has the right to collective bargaining. And there are officers of every color, every background, and every stripe in America in those unions. And the vast majority are good people committed to protecting and serving their communities. Second, we believe everyone who breaks the law must be held accountable, including union members. We can never and will never justify criminal activity. Third, collective bargaining is not the enemy. The enemy is a broken justice system that in too many cases fails to hold perpetrators of police violence accountable. And finally, we believe that the best way to use our influence on the issue of police misconduct is to engage with our police affiliates rather than isolate them. We're committed to doing what's hard and meaningful instead of what's quick and easy.
Do you think things will be changed? Do you think there will be police reform, either whether through legislation, through collective bargaining, some other way? Do you think things will change going forward with respect to how we police our police?
I absolutely do think that, because all of us are committed and determined to make that happen. We're not going to let this opportunity just be another in a long line of injustices and discrimination toward people of color. I think the killing of George Floyd was the absolute straw that broke the camel's back. And so we're determined, we're joining with our allies, our friends, our community groups to make sure that this is an opportunity where we do change things. And as President Obama said, it's not like we don't have the playbook. We do have the playbook to make this happen. We just have to make sure that the playbook gets executed and followed. And we're determined to join with groups like Black Lives Matter and other groups to make sure that those reforms are not only instituted, but lived by from here on out.
So Richard, the police members who are members of your union are only some of the state and local employees that you represent. Talk to us about the stimulus, the so-called stimulus package. We heard different reports. On the one hand, Nancy Pelosi wants to go ahead right away. The Speaker of the House, President Trump, says there's not that big a rush, although we may need something. The jobs numbers today, they take some of the steam out of getting some more stimulus soon?
Well, David, just let me reconcile the figures first. In May, we added 2.5 million jobs. But remember, in March and April, we lost 22 million. So we're still down 19.6 million jobs. The official unemployment rate is 13.3%, and that's a welcome improvement over April. But aside from April, it's still worse than anything we've seen since the Great Depression. And the unemployment rate does not reflect all coronavirus-related job losses. In fact, only about 2/3 of the people who remain out of work as a result of the virus are showing up unemployed. Listen to this. About 15%, or 4.9 million, of those out of work because of the virus are being misclassified. They've been furloughed. They should have been counted as unemployed or temporarily laid off, but instead they're being counted as employed but not at work. And roughly a fifth, or 6.6 million of those out of work because of the virus are being counted as having dropped out of the labor force. That's because jobless people only get counted as unemployed if they're actively seeking work, which remains impossible for a number of them. So if all 32.5 million workers who are out of work as a result of the virus are shown up as unemployed, the unemployment rate would have been 19.7% in May instead of 13.3. 19.7 or 13.3 demands immediate action. It doesn't say, wait, wait, wait. And by the way, 16.2 million people have already lost their health care, and more every day. That has to be remedied. The HEROES Act has to be passed.
So all that said, how confident are you that the HEROES Act will be passed, and more important, perhaps, when?
Well, the pressure continues to build. If you look at the rate right now in Kentucky, in Mitch McConnell's home state, you have over 40% of the people in Kentucky of pre-pandemic labor force have filed for regular unemployment benefits. 40% in his own state. And he says, wait, there's nothing to do. And if you're in Georgia, it's actually 45%. Numbers are staggering. And so the pressure continues to build, and he continues to do nothing at his own peril. He and other people running on that same do-nothing ticket, or let's wait, 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 while people suffer, and die, and get laid off more and more and more. He does so at his own peril. So I think the pressure mounts. I think we do get the HEROES Act passed, and I think we get it done in the month of June.
Okay, thank you so much, Richard. Always a treat to have you with us. That is Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO. And a programming note, later today, Wall Street Week is back, and we'll be joined by Mona Mahajan of Allianz and by Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, to talk about those jobs numbers that we got today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Well, President Trump took a victory lap today, earlier, about those remarkable jobs numbers that came in so much better than anyone expected them to. And for more, we're now turned to Kevin Cirilli. He's our chief Washington correspondent. So, Kevin, the president's none too unhappy with those numbers, I'd say.
No, he is not. And in fact, it was a pleasant surprise, I'm told, by White House administration officials, as well as from Republican members of Congress. Here's the thinking inside of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and the reelection campaign. If they can continue, David, with this trend of positive economic data month after month, they will be able to say that it's their administration, their set of conservative ideology that is going to rebound the economy, a contrast they hope to make with the Biden campaign. Now, of course, this was a good morning in what has otherwise been a tumultuous week inside of the nation's capital, marked by protests and unrest throughout the city.
Yeah, at the same time, I guess my question is, in terms of politics, in terms of the election, is it more important that they're adding jobs at the rate of 2.5 million or more per month, or that, in fact, they lost more than 40 million? That's a big hole to fill. They got a long way. At the rate of 2.5 per month, they're not going to get there by November.
Precisely. And their argument, and I was speaking with two Republican House members earlier this morning about this, because, you know, it is, the numbers, David, are just, we've talked about this before, just so hard to grasp and so difficult to understand. But they're saying, according to their perspective, if that they would be able to reopen, to rebuild faster than a Democratic-controlled House and Senate, and, of course, a Democrat in the White House. And, in fact, I did speak with a source at the Treasury Department earlier today who said, essentially, collectively, they were breathing a sigh of relief, and that they're hopeful that this could be the start of a broader trend of positive economic indicators.
Well, that's good news for the White House, and I'm almost reluctant to raise this because it seems like a cheap shot, but it isn't. Vice President Biden, on, I guess, a virtual meeting with supporters, said yesterday that 10 to 15% of Americans were bad people. What was that about? Are they walking back off of that? How are they handling that?
So they're trying to walk back on that, but this comes at a time in which it's very much reminiscent of the Hillary Clinton deplorable comment. From the Biden campaign's perspective, they are trying to reestablish, to rebuild the Obama coalition, many of which faltered for Hillary Clinton in the last cycle. So from their perspective, they want to unify the African-American vote. They want to build upon the midterm elections in suburbs, but they also need a strong turnout. It's not just about the percentage numbers in terms of demographics. It's about boosting that turnout, particularly among African Americans. So from their perspective, I think that's why you're seeing really the Biden campaign double down in terms of those conversations. And I spoke with a senior advisor to the vice president's campaign over the weekend who mentioned that much and saying they have to not just, again, rebuild that coalition, but make sure that there's a strong turnout.
Yeah, it's a strategy. Okay, thank you so much to Kevin Cerulli, our chief Washington correspondent, for that report from Washington. Coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power on radio, we're going to have two very special guests, Carly Fiorina, former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, and Tom Steyer, former presidential candidate. This is Bloomberg.